Let us pray. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So a few years ago, I saw an interview for a book that was popular at the time. You do click on the next slide, you can see I had to scratch out part of the title of the book. The book used a word that's not for polite settings like churches, but it means jerk. And it was written by a University of California, Irvine ethicist. And he wanted to know, like, who are jerks or why are jerks jerks? That was kind of his question. He said he wasn't working on like the really big evil questions. He wasn't working on Mussolini and Hitler and those types, although they're jerks also. The question he was working on was that like everyday question of why are people jerks in their everyday life. He gave some common examples of who a jerk might be. The jerk is the person who jumps the line in front of you. He said that often it's the one who uses their power to get extra privileges. This morning as I was walking to the street to come to church, there was a Porsche SUV parked in the walking lane, you know, the green walking lanes they put in to walk in. And then as I started to cross the pathway, like almost ran me over, like it came almost to run me over. That's kind of like a jerk behavior. The basic attitude of the jerk, he says, is that I deserve special treatment and I can do what I want. That's the basic attitude of the jerk. And then according to this author, Aaron James, there's a good jerk test. Let's come to the next slide. The question the jerk asks is, do you know who I am? I don't know if you've ever met people who ask that question. James says that some jerks know they're jerks, but for many of them, they just assume that they deserve what they deserve, which is everything. They're willing to waste your time. They might demand money or respect. They want to make a decision themselves that the whole group should decide. And the reason I started reading this book, or I got interested in this book, is because I know that sometimes I myself am a jerk, as you probably are also. And I hope I'm not a major league jerk, but probably sometimes I am. So my major league jerk tendencies tend to come out when I'm feeling like busy or stressed out or worried. And if you're like me, you're probably more likely to be a jerk if you didn't sleep well the night before, or maybe if you're in a big crowd and everybody is pushing each other, or maybe if you have a deadline looming. If there's something important for you that you have to get done right now, it's a lot easier to kind of become a jerk. Let's click to the next slide. So at first, this might not seem to have a whole lot to do with today's reading, but I promise you that there's a connection. In today's reading, Paul makes a big point of telling us who he is and who he was. It's kind of a, don't you know who I am? He lets people know that he used to be a big shot. He was from a good family. He had all the credentials that you could have, and his work spoke for itself. He was good at what he did. But he was also a jerk, and now he counts it all as loss. Today's passage is one where Paul reflects on the transformation that happened when he met the risen Lord, and he came to see that everything he had sought was a loss. Paul had been a persecutor of the church. He had been full of righteous anger, but he realized he was wrong. In today's passage, he writes to the church in Philippi. Like you can kind of see, it's sort of hidden up over between Thessalonica. And he visited Philippi at least twice. This was part of the second trip he did. And Philippi was a church where he mentions the overseers and deacons. There's some mention of conflict, so he's trying to work maybe on resolving conflicts in the church. And his letter is sort of pastoral. It's working on how can we all get along, how can we take care of each other, and also missionary, how can we reach out into the community beyond us. So in today's passage, he writes while he's on a journey, and he seems to be writing to the church to pass on the lessons that he has learned. And he is both pastoral and missionary. So let me click to the next slide. Pastor Stephen told me we have several different Bible versions, so sometimes it's fun to compare them. But this is one where Paul sort of gives his his background, and it relates his transformation from being a jerk to being a disciple. He says, if someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. I was circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, faultless. But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. So, in that particular passage, there are 7 ways that Paul describes himself. He goes through and he sort of lists each of the things that characterize him. He says that, he's part of Israel from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Hebrew of Hebrews, means like he's not somebody doing this casual. He put his whole life into this. He was a Pharisee. He was trained in the law. He'd given years and years of study in his life to becoming an expert on the law and following it. And he was zealous in his faith and persecuted the church. So he says he was such an effective apostle, he was such an effective worker in this system that he even showed his zeal in persecuting the church and rooting out what he thought were errors in the way things were. And he concludes it by saying that as for righteousness based on the law, he was faultless. So he had every credential, he had every title, he had every accomplishment. He was privileged and entitled and righteous. And it's a pretty strong statement to make, that statement where he says, as far as this goes, like, I was faultless. So he's not saying he was pretty good, he's saying he was perfect. And it's a strong claim, but Paul makes it. And probably, according to the law, he was totally righteous. He was totally blameless. The things he did as a righteous religious leader. He knew what blasphemy was, he knew the difference between right and wrong. And he kept going this way until he realized that everything he thought he knew had been wrong. Everything he counted as gain was loss. He had misunderstood what it means to follow God. He had misunderstood righteousness, and he had misunderstood zealousness. So, part of what Paul does in this passage is to use his own experience to reframe the question of what matters to God. What matters in life. In essence, Paul says, I followed all the rules, I won all the awards, and yet I was still confused, mistaken, and lost. In Christ, he finds a new orientation and a new way of being. For us also, this is the goal of Christian life. Often we are so focused that we lose perspective. Some of the metaphors we use for life reflect this. We maybe talk about the rat race or the grind. In his life, Paul inverts the normal path. He flips from being a respected teacher and leader, a dual citizen and a cosmopolitan leader, and then later on he becomes a tent maker who follows God and tries to do what God wants. Maybe click one more slide. I sympathize a lot with Paul, and in some ways I sometimes feel a little bit like an American Presbyterian version of Paul. That I have the same sort of pedigree Paul lists, like, right? Paul says, circumcised, tribe of Israel, Benjamin, Pharisee, did all the training, and then I was totally wrong about everything. And my parents are retired pastors, the Reverend Dr. Craig Seitz, the Reverend Dr. Gene Seitz. I went to a Presbyterian college, a Presbyterian seminary, a Presbyterian PhD program. I teach at a Presbyterian college now. The church I went under care of was in Princeton, which feels big and important. I come to Schwanlian, which is also kind of a big, important church. You guys are known as being like kind of one of the big centers of Presbyterianism. My wife, Emily, is an elder, which, in Taiwan you can't do that. In America, you can be an elder pretty quickly. The twins were baptized here. Like, I'm rooted in Presbyterianism, the same way that for good and bad, I don't know, we can discuss that today, I'm rooted in Presbyterianism. And what Paul is saying is he was saying he had his life all planned out and figured out, and he thought he knew who he was and what people he came from, and then he realized that he was a jerk. And in the same way, I think I can say in my own life I've sometimes seen changes over the years. I'm 41 right now, so until a few years ago I never heard the phrase midlife crisis. Have any of you heard midlife crisis? Anybody heard that phrase? So it's, I think mine started a little bit on the young side, but The gist of it is that I realized that just as Paul had done, often I had defined myself by all these categories that had been given to me. That it's easy, in Taiwan to be Laoser is very important, or I thought about my parents, that my parents had lived their life and I lived a life that was very similar. And a few years ago, maybe as Paul did, I realized that it's easy to take this experience and become a jerk out of it. It's easy to define yourself according to these things that have happened in your life. And what Paul says is when he gets to the end, he realizes that it's lost or it's garbage, that his meaning comes from something else. And for me also, I began to realize that my identity isn't defined primarily by what I do. It's not my abilities as a teacher or as a missionary. It's not based necessarily even on the quality of my sermons or on how people look at me, on if people see me as important or unimportant. Instead, it's defined by who God is, and it's defined by God's witness. So let's click back one more slide. Can you go the other way? Okay, great. So after reflecting on this change that's happened in his life, Paul writes, "What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own that comes from the law, but that which is through faith in Christ, the righteousness that comes from God on the basis of faith. I want to know Christ, yes, to know the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead." So for Paul, knowing Christ brings a new orientation. We're called out to put together our core self with what God wants for us. There's a pastor I respect named Eugene Peterson, and one of the things he's known for is the idea of congruence. Congruence means like the way I live my life matches the way I think I should live my life. And it's kind of an anti-jerk theology, right? Because instead of focusing on self-importance or on how others view me or taking advantage of things, I try to live my life in a way that honors God. Eugene Peterson says, "The Christian life is the lifelong practice of attending to the details of congruence. Congruence between ends and means, congruence between what we do and the way we do it, the congruence of the Word made flesh in Jesus with what is lived in flesh." So I think part of Paul's goal for us in this passage also is to live out our lives in that way, to not aspire to the "do you know who I am" kind of view of the world, but instead to humbly seek after Christ and to know him. So one of the hardest challenges in the Christian life is matching up our faith with how we believe. Okay, let's go down. Okay, so for you all, some of you, I can't totally tell where everybody is today. Some of you are still looking a little shocked. I hope I didn't, with the jerk focus, I hope didn't throw us off too much. But I really believe that one of the core questions for us as Christians is how does our faith affect our daily life? Like when we live out our life, are we jerks, or do we really try to follow God and to pass on those messages? So there are three things that I was really impressed by in Paul's letters to the Philippians that I hope we can live out also. For many of us, that a key challenge in our life may be dealing with the everyday jerk behavior and also trying not to be jerks ourselves. And I think Paul's a help here. I think in some ways Paul is kind of a recovering jerk. And so he can guide us on a path that helps us to follow who Christ is. So first, I think we can be really careful about thinking ourselves righteous. That if Paul's conversion experience is not a shift from, let's go back, we'll stay on this slide for a little while. The clicker doesn't quite reach all the way there, so it's different technology. So what Paul warns us about is that often we think we're living a righteous life, and we may be totally wrong about it. That we have to be careful about thinking ourselves righteous. That sometimes that when we're confident that we're most respectful or most zealous or most righteous, that's actually when we're wrong. In a real way, the story of Paul's conversion, it's not a story of somebody who was kind of the down and out criminal element. It's a story of somebody who was a lot like us, the good churchgoer who realized that he had misunderstood what it meant to follow God. Second, we can be willing to lose more of our core identity and replace that identity with God. We can lose the attitude, we can lose our self-righteousness, we can lose the rubbish that crowds out our life and fills it up with things that really aren't important. We can strip away some of the layers of self-righteousness and shame, of fear, of anger. We can turn away from those kind of jerk tendencies and seek out a truer person that follows God in all the days of our life. And then Paul often concludes with kind of an upbeat message. In the last verses of today's reading, he talks about seeking to know Christ and pressing on toward the goal to win the prize. He realizes that sort of the things he had considered major accomplishments hadn't brought him closer to God. And he urges us to focus on God, to focus on that one thing, and pursue it with all of our passion and energy, and to follow it as best we can. So in our own lives, it can be hard sometimes to tell what is a loss and what is a gain. Let's click on to the last slide. So during communion, the Lord's Supper, we remember the disciples who thought they were gathering for an ordinary celebratory meal. They came to eat and to laugh and to enjoy that meal. And at the same time, Jesus was sitting with them preparing for death. The meal itself had held a world of meaning, as some shared what was just an annual holiday feast, while the host was preparing himself for what was to come, for betrayal and suffering, for rejection and even death. For us also, communion can be a meal that reorients us. Your nationality, your occupation, your family, even your zealotry don't count here. They're not part of what this meal means. We think of them as gain, but often those things are loss. The meal is intended precisely for those like us who often mistake what is of value and what is worthless. So let us come to the table and meet God. We have much to lose and even more to gain. Let us pray. God, you are the Lord of the righteous and the self-righteous, the meek and the jerks. Sometimes we think we know who we are, but really you know us more deeply than we know ourselves. We pray that you help us to be transformed as Paul was transformed, and to seek you as he sought you. And we pray that in the meals we share, we may truly know you. Amen.